So a very good afternoon to one and all attending this lecture. So this is the lecture 3 on biodiversity. So in the last lecture, we learn about the different patterns of biodiversity. So where we learn about the global patterns of biodiversity, how the species vary locally and how the species vary with time. That is the spatial pattern. And then we learn about the spatial pattern, that how with the changes in the space coordinates, there is a change in the biodiversity. So in that we learn about the patterns of biodiversity along the latitudinal gradient and the species area relationship, which was given by Alexander. So basically in the species area relationship, we learn from about the Alexander, how we learn that how with the increase in the space, or how with the increase in the like along the space coordinate, if we will see, there will be the increase in the there will be the increase in the biodiversity, but up to a limit. Therefore, the graph which was described for describing the species area relationship by Alexander von Humboldt was actually turns out to be a rectangular hyperbola, and if we see it in a logarithmic scale, it will be a straight line. So the equation for which was S is equal to Ca square. So this was about the species richness along species area relationship. And then we learn about the biodiversity pattern in time, that how there are different patterns of biodiversity along the time. So there are some seasonal patterns, some successional pattern, and evolutionary pattern of biodiversity we described with the time. In the last, we learn about the loss in the biodiversity. So we know that already we have suffered a great loss in the biodiversity, and the last 20 years have witnessed the disappearance of about 27 species, which is a very alarming rate at which the biodiversity is decreasing. And if this rate keeps on continuing, there will be difficulty not only for the animals but also for the survival of the humans. So therefore, it is really important to conserve the biodiversity. So in today's lecture, which mainly focuses on the different steps for the conservation of biodiversity, and we will learn about these steps one by one. So first of all, before knowing the different steps that we may take to conserve the biodiversity, it is really important to know what are the threats to the biodiversity. So there are different threats, especially human activities have threatened the biodiversity on global, regional and local scales. So the human activities, as we discussed in the last lecture, also have shown to be one of the major factors that has or major threat to the biodiversity. And these activities have actually proven to be the major reason for the loss in the biodiversity in the recent years. So the threats which are posed by these activities are of four major types, and they are described by the sobriquet, the evil quartet. So these four major types of threats which the biodiversity is facing or which has led to the loss in the biodiversity are: first, the habitat loss, where the loss in the habitat of a particular species may result in the extinction or endangerment of that species. The second is the introduced species, where the introduction of the some outside species which are not native to the place uh, may overpower the native species in terms of growth or resource utilization, thereby depleting the growth of the native species. The third is the overexploitation. So overexploitation of the resources, uh, overexploitation of the items that we receive from these diversity has led to the loss in the biodiversity. And then the co-extinction. So in the last chapter, where we were discussing about the interactions between the different organisms and the different population, there we learn about the mutualism. So we know that in mutualism, there is a codependency, or there is a dependency of both the organisms of the different populations on each other, either for the food, habitat, or for the reproduction, or for the, like, they might help in the pollination, etc., thereby helping in the growth of the organism. So in that case also we learned that the extinction of one of these species might affect the extinction of the other species as well, therefore resulting in the co-extinction, because the other species might not be able to survive, in the absence of the partner species that was helping the particular species mutually. So these are the major threats, or these are the major threats to the biodiversity, and we will learn about these threats one by one. So the first is the habitat loss or the fragmentation. So human alteration of habitat is the single greatest threat to biodiversity throughout the biosphere. So basically the changes in the habitat or the habitat loss due to human activities like construction of buildings or clearing of forests for the agriculture development has is one of the greatest the biodiversity throughout the biosphere. So habitat loss has been caused by the agriculture, urban development, forestry, mining and pollution. So all of these has lead to the loss in the habitat of a particular species, resulting in the biodiversity loss. Global climate change is already altering habitats today, and we will have an even larger effect later in this century. So we know that global climate change is which might be due to some human activities, which might be due to the changes in the number of forests or due to the increase in the pollution. So all of these things have actually altered the habitats. Even today also, many of these species have changed their habitats, and in the later run, it is speculated that this change in the habitat might later affect the other species also. So when no alternative habitat is available, in case if for some species they have to vacate their native place, or they have to vacate their leave their habitat due to various human activities, and if they do not find any alternative habitat, the species is unable to move, habitat loss may even result in the extinction. So this habitat loss actually then they mean the extinction, where we can see that if there is no alternative habitat that is available for the species, it might result in the extinction of those species. The IUCN implicates destruction of physical habitat for 73% of the species that have become extinct, endangered, vulnerable, or rare in the last few hundred years. So this number is so alarming and is sufficient to tell that habitat loss is one of the major threat to the biodiversity, as this suggests that the destruction of the physical habitat for 73% of the species have result in their extinction, in their endangerment, or in their vulnerability to, like, they has led to the decrease in the number so low that they are now on the verge of the extinction or on the verge of the coming into the endangered species. So therefore, it is really like we can see that habitat loss is therefore one of the greatest threat to the biodiversity. This is the most important cause that results in the driving the animals and plants to the extinction. Whenever these plants and animals have to lose their habitat, and if they do not find any alternative habitat to live or to survive, then this might lead to their extinction. So this is one of the important cause that drives the animals and plants to the extinction. And the most dramatic example of habitat loss come from the tropical rainforest. So once covering more than 14% of the Earth's land surface, these rainforests now cover no more than 6%, and they are being destroyed fast. So therefore, these cover more than 14% of the Earth's land surface, and these rainforests now cover no more than 6%. They are being destroyed fast. The Amazon rainforest, which is called as the lungs of the planet due to the huge number of plants that supply the oxygen to the other species that exist on this biosphere, they harbor probably millions of species. They are now being cut and cleared for cultivating soya beans or for conversion to grasslands or for raising the beef cattle. So all of these major destructions in the habitat has led to the changes in the habitat of many species, millions of species that you can't even imagine. And therefore, if uh, out of these number of species that have to change their habitat, many of them may suffer the extinction, or many of them may come under the category of endangered or vulnerable species. Besides total loss, the degradation of many habitats by pollution has threatened the survival of many species. So not only the clearance of forests, but the increase in the pollution has also forced some of the animals to change their habitat. So when large habitats are broken up into smaller fragments due to various human activities, mammals and birds requiring large territories and certain animals with migratory habitats are badly affected, thereby leading to their population decline. So there are certain cases where the habitats broke up into smaller fragments due to various human activities, and this smaller fragment is not enough for the survival of the, like, is not enough, does not provide the enough territorial space to some of the species, and it might therefore affect the migratory birds or the certain animals that require the large territories, leading to their decrease in the population. The next is the over exploitation. So humans have always been dependent on the nature for food and shelter, but when need turns to greed, it leads to over exploitation of natural resources. So as I discussed earlier also, that the over exploitation or the overutilization of the natural resources might also be one of the causes for the destruction or the loss in the biodiversity. So many species extinctions in the last 500 years, like Steelers sea cow, passenger pigeon, were due to the overexploitation by humans. And presently, there are many marine fish populations around the world are over harvested. Due to the over harvestation, there might be decrease in their population, such that population might decrease so low that uh, they might become endangered. So endangering the continued existence of some commercially important species. So like over exploitation has also been one of the major causes that has led to the decrease in the diversity, or it is a major threat to the biodiversity, as overexploitation of the resources by the humans have led to the extinction of various species. Example is Steelers cow or passenger pigeon, or there are many marine fishes which are harvested daily, or which are actually over harvested at so around the world. So this might also lead to their endangerment, and the continued existence of the commercially important species will come under the category of the endangered species. The next is alien species introduction. So introduced species are also called as non-native or exotic species, and these are those that humans move intentionally or accidentally from these species native locations to new geographic regions. So this might or might not be the activity of human results, as humans might intentionally or accidentally lead to the changes in the habitat of some other species. And when these introduced species or alien species, or we can say exotic species that are not native to a particular place, so when they are introduced unintentionally or deliberately for whatever the purpose is, some of them might turn into the invasive species. So they might compete with the native population for the resources. They might compete with the native population for the space. They might compete with them for the food. And sometimes they become invasive, overpower the native species, and they become invasive, thereby causing the decline or the extinction of the indigenous species or the local species that were actually the native of that particular place. So the Nile perch introduced into the Lake Victoria in East Africa led eventually to the extinction of an ecologically unique assemblage of more than 200 species of cichlid fish in the lake. So the environmental damage caused and threat posed to our native species by invasive weed species like carrot grass, we all know, Parthenium, lantana, and water hyacinth. It also become very difficult that once these species become invasive, it is difficult to get rid of them, because since they are now growing in their non-native place, we do not know, like we do not have any natural predators for them that might actually, or we do not have any natural competitors for them that regulate their growth in a sustainable manner so that they do not overgrow. But since they are growing in a non-native environment, they do not have any natural predators or they do not have any natural competitors, and thereby they grow, and therefore they grow at exceedingly high rate, and also overpower the native species, leading to the decrease in the number or extinction of the indigenous or native species of that particular area. So therefore, it is really important, and now various checks have been imposed where we are not allowed to carry the seeds. Even the seeds are not allowed to be carried in the from one country to another country without the check system. So this is also the step to prevent this introduction of the alien species that will harm the native species of the country. So the recent illegal introduction of the African catfish, that is clarias, for aquaculture purpose is posing a threat to the indigenous catfishes in our rivers. So introduced species, so these are just few examples. And introduced species are a worldwide problem that contributes to approximately 40% of the extinctions recorded since 1750, and costing billions of dollars each year in damage and control efforts. Because as I mentioned, that the control efforts or the damage which is caused by these species is high, and the control efforts required are also like very expensive, because we do not have any natural predators or the competitors of such species in our environment, in that a new environment for these species where they have been introduced. So basically in that cases it becomes difficult to get rid of these introduced species, and therefore it is a like $1 billion burden on the economy, where like it costs billions of dollars each year in damage and control efforts. And there are more than 50,000 introduced species in the United States alone. So these species from this, some of them might not be harmful, but yeah, many of them may be harmful. And even if few of them is harmful, then the damage is high. So it is really difficult to get rid of them, and therefore it is very important to prevent this illegal introduction of the introduced species or the alien species into the indigenous environment. The next is the co-extinction. So when a species become extinct, the plant and the animal species associated with it in an obligatory way also become extinct. So when they are obligatory way means when they are exclusively dependent on each other, then the loss in one of the species will definitely lead to the extinction of the other species also. So when a host fish species become extinct, its unique assemblage of parasites also meets the same fate. Another example is the case of co-evolved plant pollinator mutualism, where extinction of one invariably leads to the extinction of the other. So this co-evolution actually, especially in case of where there is the chances of co-evolution, in that cases there are high chances of co-extinction as well. If the extinction of one species takes place, then it is difficult for the survival of the other species. And ultimately, if it is not evolved independently later on, or does not evolve in such a way that it finds a new mutual partner, then the species become extinct. So these are the major threats that the biodiversity is facing, like habitat loss, introduced species, overexploitation, and co-extinctions. But what is the need for the preservation of of the biodiversity? Like, why should we preserve the biodiversity, or what is the need to conserve the biodiversity? So we know that David Tillman, basically, he described that an area with a higher species abundance is a more stable environment compared to an area with the lower species abundance. Because definitely wherever there will be the lower number of species, the extinction, so the food web will be very, like, will not be very complicated, and there will be a single species that is dependent on the other one which is dependent on some third one. So in that case, the extinction or the missing link of between the any of these species might result in the loss in the other species, of loss of the other species as well, or loss in the biodiversity. But when there is a high species richness, it is considered that the environment is comparatively stable, because if we are not, until or unless we are not co-evolving and we are not obligatorily dependent on each other, we might find some other resource in the environment on which we can feed, or where we can find a habitat. So the necessity of biodiversity can be claimed by considering our degree of dependency on the environment. So if I talk about the in context of humans, so the necessity for the biodiversity conservation is obviously the dependency, our dependency on the environment. We know that we are highly dependent on the various environmental resources, and therefore it is really important to actually preserve these biodiversity. We depend directly on various species of plants for our various needs, like medicinal plants for some for various for like we have plants on various plant extracts that have medicinal properties or some healing properties. Then we are dependent on the plants for the oxygen. So there are various needs of humans for which they are directly dependent on the plants. Similarly, we are not only dependent on the plants, but we are also dependent on the other animals and the microbes for different reasons. And the biodiversity is being lost due to the loss of habitat, overexploitation, climatic changes, pollution, invasive exotic species, diseases, hunting, etc. So since it provides us with several economic and ethical benefits and aesthetic value, it is really important to consider the point to conserve the biodiversity. So the need to conserve biodiversity can be grouped into three categories. That is the narrow utilitarian, broadly utilitarian, and ethical. So there are like the narrow utilitarian arguments for conserving the biodiversity are obvious. Humans derive countless direct economic benefits from nature, food like cereals, pulses, fruits, etc., firewood, fiber, construction material, industrial products like tannins, lubricants, dyes, resins, perfumes, etc., and obviously the products of the medicinal importance. More than 25% of the drugs that are currently sold in the market worldwide are derived from the plants, and 25,000 species of plants contribute to the traditional medicines used by the native peoples around the world. Therefore, these narrow utilitarian arguments are the obvious arguments. Like, these are the arguments that when we will read, we realize that, yeah, we are highly and completely dependent on the environment. So the usefulness of medicinal plants in tropical rainforests are still to be explored. Now, with increasing resources put into bioprospecting, that is exploring molecular, genetic, and species level diversity for products of economic importance, nations endowed with rich biodiversity can expect to reap enormous benefits. Because now we are getting to know more and more biodiversity, we are getting to know the differences at the genetic level, we are getting to know the differences, explore the differences at the molecular level. So even a slight difference at the molecular or genetic level may have the changes in the properties of the extracts that we are obtaining from the plants, where one might have, like, so therefore the countries or the nations that endowed with rich biodiversity can expect to reap the enormous benefits. The broadly utilitarian argument says that biodiversity plays a major role in many ecosystem services and nature provides. So the fast dwindling Amazon forest is estimated to produce through photosynthesis 20% of the total oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. Pollination, without which the plants cannot give us fruits or seeds and other services. Ecosystem provide through pollinator layers like bee, humblebees, birds, and bats. And now there are other intangible benefits that we derive from nature, the aesthetic pleasure. So when we walk through thick foods, we feel that aesthetic pleasure, watching spring flowers in full bloom or waking up to a bulbul singing in the morning. So all of these are the broadly utilitarian arguments that actually provides the need to the conservation of biodiversity, where the biodiversity is playing a major role in providing the many ecosystem services that the nature provides. So some of them, as we see, are the production of the oxygen by the Amazon forest. Like Amazon forest, as I mentioned, is also known as the lungs of the environment or the of the biosphere, where they are providing the 20% of the total oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere, or the pollination, which is carried out by the pollinators like bees, bumblebees, birds, and bats. So these pollinators are providing services to the ecosystem, and there are other intangible benefits like the aesthetic pleasure that we obtain when we see flowers blooming. So these or when we see birds singing. So these are the aesthetic pleasures. Therefore, these arguments come under the broadly utilitarian arguments, and also these arguments are also sufficient enough to say that yeah, it is important to preserve the biodiversity. The third and obvious is also the ethical argument. So for the ethical argument for conserving biodiversity relates to what we owe to millions of plants, animals, and microbe species with whom we share this planet. So philosophically and spiritually, if we talk about, we need to realize that every species has an intrinsic value, even if it may be not of use for us in the current scenario, or it does not hold any economic value for us. But every individual or every species that is present on the earth or that exists on the earth, if I talk about philosophically and spiritually, these species also have or also are of like they also have an intrinsic value. So there is some intrinsic value that is always associated with the with every species, and irrespective of whether they are of importance for us in the current scenario or whether they are of any economic value to us in the current scenario, it is really important to preserve or conserve this biodiversity. Now, ethical argument also suggests that we have a moral duty to take care of their well-being and pass on our biological legacy in good order to the future generations. So what are the different steps that we can take to conserve the biodiversity? So the biodiversity conservation is the protection and management of biodiversity to obtain resources for sustainable development. So as I mentioned also that it is our moral duty to take care of the well-being and pass the legacy, like to pass this uh, good order to the future in good order, like to pass on these biodiversities on our biological legacy in good order to our future generations. It is really important to measure the to conserve the biodiversity, and it is the protective and management of biodiversity to obtain the resources for sustainable development. So biodiversity conservation has three main objectives. Firstly, it tries to preserve the diversity of species. The second is sustainable utilization of these species and ecosystem to prevent the overexploitation of the resources. And the third is to maintain the life supporting system and essential ecological processes so that the ecological processes remain in continuation and they do not terminate, thereby preventing the loss in the biodiversity. So when we conserve and protect the whole ecosystem, its biodiversity at all levels is protected. We save the entire forest to save the tiger. This approach. So whenever we are trying to conserve the biodiversity in their local habitat, so this approach will be called as in situ or on-site conservation. However, there are certain situations where we have to like take care of the endangered plants or animals which are in the very high risk of extinction in the wild in near future. So there is an urgent need to save them, and therefore what we do is we cannot save them inside, or sorry, in an in situ approach, using in situ approach. Therefore, what we do is we perform or we try to do the off-site conservation of such species, that is the exit. We try to take the approach of ex situ, that is off-site. So biodiversity conservation can be divided into in situ conservation and ex situ. In situ means on-site, ex situ means off-site. In situ conservation includes the biodiversity hotspots, protected areas like biosphere reserves, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, sacred groves, and ex situ conservation involves the protection of gametes since these species are nearly endangered or are on the verge of extinction. So the scientists try to protect their gametes by by collecting those gametes in the gene bank so that they can perform in vitro fertilization. And then whenever the species are enough to be introduced into the natural habitat, they will be introduced later. So protection of gametes can be done in gene bank, seed bank for the plants, or tissue culture. And for the protection of threatened species, we can have botanical gardens, zoological parks, wildlife safaris. So in situ conservation, which is an on-site conservation of biodiversity, is the conservation of species within their natural habitat. In this method, the natural ecosystem is maintained and protected. And by maintaining the natural ecosystem or by maintaining or protecting the entire forest, we are trying to provide the natural habitat to the losing biodiversity so that their number does not decrease further. The in situ conservation has several advantages, and firstly, it is a cost-effective and convenient method, as we do not need to displace or dislocate the threatened species from their, like dislocate the species from their natural habitat to some artificial habitat. So it is a cost-effective and convenient method for conserving the biodiversity. A large number of living organisms can be conserved simultaneously. So in an attempt, for example, if I am trying to attempt if I am attempting to prevent the tigers in a forest, and if for that, if I try to take the approach of in situ conservation, where basically we are trying to where we actually protect the forest so that the tigers do not suffer the habitat loss. So in that way, we are following that approach. We are also protecting the habitat for the several other species that reside in the same forest. So a large number of organisms can be conserved simultaneously using this approach. Now, since the organisms are in natural ecosystem, they can evolve better and can easily adjust to different environmental conditions, because we are not dislocating these organisms from their natural ecosystem to some artificial ecosystem. Certain protected areas where in situ conservation takes place include national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and biosphere reserves. So national parks, what are national parks? So these are small reserves that are maintained by the government. Its boundaries are well demarcated and human activities such as grazing, forestry, habitat, and cultivation are prohibited. For example, the Kanha National Park and Bandipur National Park. The second is wildlife sanctuaries. So these are the regions where only wild animals are found. Human activities such as timber harvesting, cultivation, collection of woods, and other forest products are allowed here as long as they do not interfere with the conservation project. Also, tourists visit these places for recreation. The third is a biosphere reserve. So biosphere reserves are multi-purpose protected areas where the wildlife, traditional lifestyle of the inhabitants, and domesticated plants and animals are protected. Tourist and research activities are permitted here. So basically, there is the differences in the relaxation that we have in these different areas. So national park is highly protected, highly maintained by the government. These are the small reserves that are maintained and their boundaries are well demarcated, inside which no human activity is allowed. While in case of wildlife sanctuaries, we see that some of the activities, until or unless they are not affecting or interfering with the conservation project, they are allowed to be carried out. Also, in case of biosphere reserves, they are multi-purpose protected areas where the animals are protected, or the domesticated plants and animals are protected, and tourist and research activities are permitted. In India, ecologically unique and biodiversity rich regions are legally protected as biosphere reserves, national parks, and sanctuaries. And India now has 14 biosphere reserves, 90 national parks, 448 wildlife sanctuaries. India has also a history of religious and cultural tradition that emphasize protection of nature. So we know that in India we actually worship certain plants, and thereby in order, for example, if I take an example of tulsi plant, so there are many places all over the India where this plant is worshipped. Therefore, in order to worship those plants, these plants are considered as sacred, and therefore humans try to cultivate those plants instead of uh, cutting those plants. So basically, these religious and cultural traditions have also emphasized the protection of nature. So in many cultures, tracts of forest were set aside, and all the trees and wildlife within were venerated and give total protection. Such sacred groves are found in Khasi and Jaintia hills in Meghalaya, Aravalli hills of Rajasthan, Western Ghat regions of Karnataka, Maharashtra, and this Sarguja, Chanda and Bastar areas of Madhya Pradesh. So these are some of the regions where the forests are considered as sacred groves, and they give total protection on the basis of their cultural habitats. They give their total protection to these forests, and thereby preventing the loss of biodiversity from there. In Meghalaya, the sacred groves are the last refugees for a large number of rare and threatened plants. So there are certain rare and threatened plants that are actually the last refugees in the sacred groves of the Meghalaya, where the people of Meghalaya have their cultural sentiments attached to that and are therefore trying to protect them. The next, as I mentioned, was the XII conservation. So XII conservation of biodiversity involves the breeding and maintenance of endangered species in artificial ecosystem, for example, zoo, nurseries, botanical gardens, gene banks, etc. There is less competition for food, water, and space among the organism, and therefore it is easy for the organism to survive. However, there are certain disadvantages also which are associated with this XII conservation, that the organism might feel the lack of the natural ecosystem and might might not behave normally as it used to behave in the natural ecosystem when we kept the animal in an artificial ecosystem. So XII conservation, however, has certain advantages. The animals are provided with a longer time and breeding activity. The species bred in captivity can be reintroduced in the wild. Genetic techniques can be used for the preservation of endangered species. So this was about the ex situ and in situ conservation. These are the following differences between them. So in situ conservation means being in the original position, not having been moved, while ex situ means off-site conservation, where we move the uh, species that we are trying to maintain, or the species which we are trying to increase in number. It is an on-site conservation or the conservation of genetic resources in natural populations of plants or animal species. It is the process of protecting an endangered species of plants or animals outside its natural habitat. The example for in situ conservation includes the biosphere river reserves, while the ex situ conservation includes the seed banks and botanical garden. So this was all about today's lecture, where we learn about the different threats to the biodiversity, what are the different methods to conserve the biodiversity, what is in situ method of the approach for the conservation of biodiversity, what is ex situ approach for the conservation of biodiversity, and also we'll get to know that why actually we need to conserve the biodiversity, how the loss in the biodiversity will also impact the humans and the environment. Therefore, it is really important to understand the biodiversity which is present in our nature, connect with that biodiversity, and to realizing its importance in the in for even for the humans also, it is really important to conserve the biodiversity. And so we discussed about different methods, different approaches that can be taken or that are being implemented for the conservation of these biodiversity. So with this, we had an end for the lecture 3 today. Also, we had a this is the last lecture for the biodiversity. So with this, we also end up with the chapter biodiversity. Thank you.